What is learned helplessness? Well, in India, when elephant trainers catch a baby elephant, they tie its legs with a rope to a post. And this baby elephant will struggle for days trying to break free, and it eventually gives up when it learns that it's useless. When it grows up, these trainers keep it tied using the same rope. And even though it's now strong enough to break free and escape, the elephant stands around waiting for the trainers because it's learned that it's meaningless. This elephant has developed what's known as learned helplessness. And this is the fact that despite having the power to change its situation, it's learned to feel helpless instead because of the past. It was identified by a scientist in the 1960s who'd do the same thing by shocking dogs. Highly unethical, of course. But what does this have to do with us? Well, in your life, you may have experienced a crushing defeat and learned that there's just no way to overcome it. Maybe it's not the case. Maybe that's just a story you've told yourself. Just think about it. If the average person does poorly on a test, they'll say the professor was too hard a marker. Whereas a clinically depressed person will blame themselves for not being smart enough. In both cases, the moment you give up, you've learned to be helpless of the situation. So in what ways has learned helplessness affected you?
Well, if learned helplessness is something that is associated with these negative consequences, what about the other side, right? And how can we overcome learned helplessness, right? And so by looking at learned helplessness, what is the thing that fights against it is an idea called flourishing, right? And so a lot of you have expressed interest in children developmental psychology, right? And so naturally, I just thought that this would be a fantastic exploration, since there are interest in positive psychology, interest in developmental psychology, right? Young adulthood. So here, this is the systemic predictors of adolescent flourishing, right? And so these are my students here, right? So if you know Sonali Bargotra, Juliana Fernandez, or Zillion Serpis, tell them I said hey. And so so would this fit? So Diego actually had a really good question here. So would this fit into domestic violence and why people hesitate to leave someone who is violent? Right? That could be, right? I mean, we're not saying that it's like that's the case for everybody, but it could be, right? Maybe they've learned that it's helpless, like if they've tried to escape before in the past, or they've escaped, and let's say someone threatens and like they become suicidal. If you leave me, I'll kill myself. And so they've attempted or something like that, right? Then this could be situations where now people feel helpless. They feel helpless because of the past. So that could be one reason. So that's really good, Diego. That's really good. And so for here, adolescent flourishing, we're also going to think about the learned helplessness. So keep that in the front pocket. We're also going to talk about the CDC Kaiser study, right? So Kaiser Permanente, right? In the 90s, they revealed that, and actually some I think maybe like 2 or 3 groups have actually used adverse childhood experiences. And so for those of you who are doing this in your project, this is the study that's from. The ACEs is basically adverse childhood experiences, and we'll lay out the different experiences. There's 10 of them, 9 or 10 of them that we'll talk about when we get to the methods, right? But basically, these are like, did your family divorce, or is there violence in your home? Was there drugs in your home? Did someone go to jail in your home? Those kind of things. So those are basically adverse childhood experiences. And in the 90s, CDC, Center for Disease Control, and Kaiser Permanente did a study looking at ACEs and later life health. And what they found was basically changed the dogma. They found that adults who had more adverse childhood experiences had more later life physical health conditions. Right, they were more obese. They had more cardiovascular issues, all these physical problems. And so what they were realizing was like, whoa. From an insurance perspective, if you have 2 kids one kid had no aces, one kid has 5 aces. One of these kids is going to be way more costly to you. And so the only reason I'm using it in that way is so that it kind of illustrates the point, right? It's very terse and cold and mechanistic, but to illustrate the point, just bear with me. So if I have 2 kids, one had no aces, one had 5 aces. One of these kids, from an insurance perspective, is going to cost me way more money 10, 15, 20 years from now versus the other one, right? The one with more aces. So that becomes an important framework for understanding resilience, right? So basically, at this point, this shows us that developmentally speaking, we need to take care of our kids, or at least find ways to mitigate the process, right? Because we can't always, uh, you know, um, protect, right, as much as we want. And I think current estimates in the United States is, I think, like 40% of kids under the age of 18 have already experienced at least um, one adverse childhood experience, which is, a shame. But it's what we do with it, right? Um, Flourishing, positive psychology, right? And so next we have resilience. And so resilience, yeah, this is part of a developmental process. Mastin. So if anyone who is interested in developmental positive psychology, um, look into these people, Mastin and Barnes, right? So they're basically looking at how the family system can be protective and create systemic resilience for children who have experienced an adverse childhood experience, right? So Mastin and Barnes. Um, and so ACEs showed that there was an inverse relationship with these negative health outcomes and flourishing. Um, and so, here, Michelle, offered really a nugget here of positive psych. So Mayor Seligman published a paper in 2016 to update the learned helplessness research. Contemporary neuroscience revealed that helplessness is not learned, but is the default response to prolonged adversity. What is learned is mastery and control over adversity. Wow. All right, so excellent. So now we have contemporary neuroscience that's basically saying that, kind of fitting, now connecting this contemporary neuroscience finding to what we were talking about in the first example, right, of traumatic brain injury and neuroplasticity, is with repeated treatment, like with cognitive rehab, right? We can increase the the neuro efficiency of these survivors by repeated exercise, repeated strategies. And so, thank you, Michelle. That's great. Turns out the same thing is true for positive psychology. So the same exact thing is neuroplasticity here. Yes. And so the mental health problems may be attenuated by healthy family functioning. And so to tie this now back with what Michelle just said was, if you have healthy family functioning, what is that saying, right? Kids see their family every day. They see their family every day. They go to school, they come home every day, right? So that way, this is what she calls here prolonged activity, right? Every day, day in, day out, seeing your family. That's healthy functioning. And what does that do for your flourishing? But what exactly could be related to this? And so that's what this study is going to look into. And another way that the family can do this is called emotion socialization behaviors, right? And so this was a study developed by Eisenberg in 1988. And so basically, it's the idea that what we're saying here, prolonged exposure, prolonged activity to healthy family functioning, is you see your family regulate their emotions, you see your parents regulate their emotions, then the kid can help regulate their emotions. And so help contributing to flourishing, right? And flourishing, we'll talk about, is consistent of 3 things. And so basically our hypothesis is that ACEs would be inversely related to flourishing. Families that are more resilient would be directly related to flourishing. Makes sense, it's obvious. But the thing that we're interested in is parental emotion regulation, significant predictor of flourishing. And so it's obvious enough, right? If your family is high functioning, if your parents are high functioning, then you as a kid is going to be more high functioning. But exactly how we measured this was the interesting piece, right? And so we'll get there at the end, right? And so what we used was the 2016-2017 National Survey of Children's Health, right? NSCH. This is a national data set, right? And so this national data set is representative of households of children from 0 to 17, right? And so basically this is a nationwide survey, right? It is using all of the cutting edge survey technology to collect from landlines, collect from cell phones, using voter registrations, using United States Postal Service. They call it the DSF file, right? Using all the high stratified proportional sampling, stratified geographic quota sampling, all the stuff that we're talking about on Monday or last week. So they use all the high cutting edge survey technology, right, to create this data set, the NSCH data set. And so we looked at this sample, and so the federal poverty line, we looked at those who were either below 50% of the poverty line or above 400%. So these are really on the opposite ends of the SES spectrum here. And so the measures that we had used, and so think about psychological assessment, right? So things that we've been talking about all semester, psychological assessment, right? 461, right? And then if you're interested in measuring resilience, if you're interested in measuring depression, if you're interested in measuring anxiety, stress, neurocognitive conditions, right? That's all psych testing. Measures that we use were the Family Resilience Index, or the FRI, the school and safety in the school and neighborhood. So basically, how safe do you feel in and outside of your home? And then the parental aggravation. This was how we were assessing emotion regulation, right? So does your parent feel aggravated? Or are they usually, or are they always feeling aggravated with their children? Right? So this is not even anything overt. Do you just feel aggravated? Like, I just want to wring the necks of my kids sometimes, right? It's like, there's not all the time, but most of the time, you know. And so and then we assessed their adverse childhood, their adverse experiences. And then we assessed the flourishing using the CFI. Right? And so, Michelle, I think you were interested in, like, oh, how are you measuring it? Well, there's a CFI index, right? And so what's in it? And so here are the 9 adverse childhood experiences, or specifically for their families. So number 1 was, since the child was born, has it been difficult based on your family's income to cover basics like food or housing? Did the child ever live with a parent or guardian who got divorced? Did the child ever live with a parent who died or guardian who died? Did the child ever see a parent or guardian serve jail time? Did they see anyone in the home hit, slap, kick, punch, beat each other up? Was the child ever a victim of violence or witnessed violence? Did the child ever live with someone who was mentally ill or suicidal? Anyone live with alcohol or drug problems? Or was the child ever treated or judged unfairly because his or her racial or ethnic identity? Right? And so, I mean, just going down those, like, how many have you experienced? I mean, I've experienced at least a handful of those. And so, what was protective? What helped me, right? Or what helped you? And so, for flourishing, we assess using these three things, or the flourishing assessment used these three things, right? And so basically here on this graph, so not bypass this, the most of the AFEs down here, the most ones that were experienced were AFE 1 and AFE 2. So 1 is hard to cover basics like food or housing, and 2 is was there a parent or child who ever got divorced, right? And then in our flourishing assessment, it has three components. So 1 was, does the child show genuine curiosity in learning new things, right? So like, what do my disappointments, or what do my failures, what do these have to teach me? What do my experiences have to teach me, right? 2 is, does the child stay calm and in control when faced with a challenge, right? So I mean, can they stay calm and collected, right? Can they like bounce back, right, after being with a challenge, right? Can they come back and remain calm, right? Are they resilient in that way? And then 3rd is the child finishes tasks and follows through with plans. So when they start something, can they go through it? Can they see it to the end? Right. So how we're conceptualizing this is kind of is that like a grateful child, a growth mindset child, and a resilient child. And so the CFI is what was used to assess. So now, what does this all mean, right? So we ran, and so to think about it, we wanted to know, and I didn't lay out the question, so I lay out the question now. So the question was, what of these different predictors does parental emotion regulation, does that, or what systemic predictors predict whether or not an adolescent is flourishing, right? So flourishing, yes or no, right? So flourishing, yes or no, that is essentially that's a nominal scale variable, yes and no, 0 and 1, right? So that's the thing we are predicting. Therefore, the criterion is qualitative, yes, no, right? Therefore, if what we are predicting, so predict is a regression, right? So we're on the correlation side of the tree. We're interested in a prediction, so that is a prediction on the correlation side. And then we go down, how many blocks do we have? Well, we're going to have 5 blocks, which we'll just talk about in just a moment. But anyway, that is a regression. And then the criterion, or the scale of measurement, the criterion is qualitative, right? Therefore, the most appropriate statistical analysis to answer our particular question here is a logistic regression, right? We are predicting regression, a qualitative criteria, logistic regression, yeah? So in terms of likelihood of flourishing, so now we have, we're predicting, do these systemic predictors, do they predict yes or no, right? So in terms of demographics, so we're talking about, we put in gender, we put in age, and we put income. So we control for that, right? And so think about like controlling, we put those in an earlier block, right? So when we were discussing hierarchical regression like 3-4 weeks ago, or whatever week that was, and if you have questions on that, look back at that video. I believe it was week 11 or week 12. And so here we are controlling for demographics by putting them in the first block. None of them are significant. So after controlling for demographics, we put in the second block family, adverse family experiences, right? So makes sense. Kids or adolescents with no adverse experiences were 2.81 times more likely to be flourishing, right? Versus adolescents with 4 or more adverse experiences. That makes sense, right? Right? Like twice as likely to be flourishing, granted they haven't had any experiences. That's pretty obvious. That makes sense at least. So the third model, after controlling for all of that, your family resilience. So if your family was very resilient, they endorsed all 4 items, you were 2.68 times more likely to be flourishing versus adolescents from families who have low resilience, right? Also, kind of obvious, right? So if your family was resilient, you were 2.68 times more likely to be a flourishing adolescent, right? Not so much an angsty teen, for example. Now, in the fourth model, we added what about safety, right? So families who agreed that their adolescent was completely safe were 2.16 times more likely to be flourishing versus adolescents from families who definitely disagreed with their safety. Also, pretty straightforward there. So, where the interest comes in is in this fifth model. So, after controlling for demographics, after controlling for the adverse experiences, after controlling for their family resilience, after controlling for their safety, parental aggravation, right, was the highly most significant predictor, right? So adolescents from parents who endorsed low parental aggravation toward their adolescent were 5.83 times more likely to be flourishing versus adolescents from parents who endorsed high aggravation as a parent. So here, I mean, this is a little bit less, right? So I mean, if you're a parent with high aggravation, then this becomes a circumstance where if you're feeling high levels of aggravation, this becomes a circumstance in which now positive psychology can insert its influence, right? How can it do that, right? And so like basically think about any psychology. I think of psychology. This is another way where psychology can come to the rescue, right? What works with parental aggravation, emotion regulation, is a third wave cognitive behavioral modality, a third wave CBT. It's called dialectical behavior therapy, right? DBT. And so basically, these interventions can focus more on the emotion dysregulation of the family, specifically the parent. And so, I mean, this is like, if we can already begin to identify that, okay, if parental aggravation, if we can start screening for this, right? We just saw it, we can screen for it using one of the measurements that we had in the methods. We can start screening for this stuff very, very early on, right? You don't have, I mean, either at like at your pediatrician's office or at the next PTA meeting, right? Like, okay, here parents, like do this, and so like all this kind of to start screening for this kind of stuff to identify who might be, helped by DBT, right? And that's a psychological third wave cognitive behavioral modality, right? And and so and other positive psychology sort of modalities that we can insert into here, because then interventions, like we see a child, like they're acting a fool, right? They've got and I've worked with a whole bunch of them in juvenile and they are funny, and and my heart breaks because so much of it isn't their fault. But like you see a kid, right? He's got behavioral oppositional conduct, ODD, right? Oppositional defiant disorder, right? It's a behavioral conduct disorder, right? So you have these adolescents with ODD. When really, and so now these adolescents ODD, they're the ones that's getting treated, right? They're the ones that's like going through these programs. They're the ones getting treated. When you're treating them, the adolescents, when really the problem is who the adolescents are going to at home. And so interventions focusing strictly on adolescents and not the family system are really short-lived. And so we can start to begin to identify that this may be a potential direction that we can use psychology um, to move forward in a lot of different ways. And of course, again, bringing to SB 855, right, in California, is enacting January 2021. And I know I might be overly optimistic here, I'm like, but a person can dream, right? I can dream. And so I'm very optimistic about it. And so um and until proven otherwise, I will stay optimistic. And so basically at the end of all this, just like Maston's model on resilience, who said that resilience is not a capacity, resilience is learned through your system. So through all of this, just like resilience, flourishing, just like resilience, is also a systemic endeavor. It is also a learned capacity from your family or from your system. And so, and that's it. Those are my. This is the post and everything, and yeah, it's these two were presented at APA. Granted, it was virtual this year, but it was presented in APA, and the first poster received recognition from APA Division 40, and so yeah, those are the real world examples, situations. Yeah. Yeah, that's where it is, right? And so we find ways, right? So Catherine, yeah, when there's a will, there's a way. And so that's basically how we've been put together. And so we presented both to APA this semester, doing in the virtual format. And yeah, so we're continuing the first project. We're continuing using. It's actually all virtual now. So basically, this exact same thing. So we're doing all of our classes virtually. And so let me show that to you. This is our classes currently virtually. And so TBIOC, if anyone's got an IG, right, want to follow along with the brain injury in Orange County and around the state of California, TBIOC is our handle. And so this is our fall 2020 class. So basically this is going on, right? It just ended. And so everything virtual, classes virtual, neuropsych assessments all virtual. Look here, all virtual, right? Classes went for 12 weeks, all virtual. We even had a musician, Healing Sound Bath, come on, right? And so all virtual. And so if you know anyone who might be interested in participating as a survivor of head injury in cognitive rehabilitation classes that are provided virtually, please reach out. And so that is, what we're able to do. And so any questions on the real world applications of this stuff, right? So, I talk about it, but I'm about it, right? So I be about it too. So this is stuff not just that I'm talking about, but I'm doing, and I love it. And if that's not apparent enough. Yeah. So, yeah. And any questions? I mean, this stuff is fantastic. Research methods is incredible. And what it can do for people. And so, thank you. I appreciate it very much. I appreciate you guys' comments. It's St. Jude Brain Injury Network. That's what we're doing. The Department of Rehabilitation, TBI Advisory Board, and the National Survey of Children's Health Research Survey, right? And so taking part of those teams. And so I, of course, can't forget my collaborators, Dr. Bush, Dr. Emick, Dr. Holland, Dr. Polito, Dylan, of course. Some of you know Dylan, Sonali Bargotra, Juliana Fernandez, right? And so those are my collaborators. Will we